The Galactic King sat upon his crystalline throne, surrounded by towering pillars of glowing light, each one humming with the energy of captured stars. His crown shimmered with fragments of meteors stolen from forgotten worlds, and his robe was woven with threads of nebula dust. He believed himself the eternal ruler of the cosmos, a being who could bend any race to his will with a single gesture. His soldiers were the sharpest blades of his empire, towering armored titans who obeyed his every command without hesitation. On this day the throne room was filled with echoes of boots and the clanking of weapons as the soldiers dragged in a small human family. The father struggled against the grip of the guards, his face bruised from resistance. The mother held tightly to her young daughter, shielding her eyes from the cold metallic glare of the alien warriors. The child whimpered softly, though she tried to be brave, her voice trembling as she whispered to her mother that they would be safe. The family was terrified, yet there was also a quiet strength in their eyes that the king and his court failed to notice. The king leaned forward, his gaze sharp and cruel, as he studied the trembling figures before him, his lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, only arrogance. He had captured countless beings before for his amusement or his strategy. But these humans were new prey to him. He had heard stories of their stubborn will and resilience, but he believed that in his presence, no creature could resist submission to him. They were merely fragile toys, brought to entertain his boredom. In the endless stretches of power and rule, the hall fell silent as the king raised his hand, signaling the guards to halt. He let the silence stretch long enough for fear to sink deeper into the hearts of the family, and then he rose from his throne. Each step echoed like thunder across the chamber, his robes trailing behind like a storm cloud. He stopped before the family, towering above them, and lowered his gaze to the child. She looked back at him, eyes wide, filled with both terror and defiance. The king chuckled, amused by the spark he saw. He thought it would be delightful to crush that spark and shape it into submission. The father spoke then, his voice hoarse but firm, begging the king to release them, declaring that they were no threat. The king raised his hand, and the guards struck the father down to his knees. The mother gasped but remained unbroken, clutching her child tighter. The king declared that mercy was a gift only he could give, and that they should be grateful to be alive in his presence. His words, dripped with cruelty, meant to break their spirit, yet the family still clung to each other with silent strength. Around the throne room, the courtiers and soldiers watched with interest. Some smirked, others whispered, but none dared to question their ruler. They believed this spectacle would end as all others had, with the captives bowed, broken and obedient. But what none of them knew was that this act of arrogance would ignite a storm greater than any they had ever witnessed. For this was no ordinary family, and this was no ordinary mistake. This was the first crack in the empire of the Galactic King, and though he did not yet see it, the shadow of his downfall was already taking form. The Galactic King returned to his throne, and leaned back with the calm arrogance of a ruler who believed no force in the universe could challenge him. His eyes glittered with the cruel delight of a predator who had secured prey not for survival, but for entertainment. He raised his hand, and the entire throne room bowed in silence. The family trembled before him, and though they tried to stand strong, the weight of countless eyes upon them pressed heavily upon their shoulders. The king began to speak, his voice echoing through the chamber like rolling thunder. His words painted himself as the chosen one, the eternal conqueror, the supreme ruler of every system, from the burning sons of the East Nebulae to the frozen voids beyond the Black Rift. He declared that all who lived were his to command, and all who breathed were his to toy with. He told the humans that their capture was an honor, that they had been selected to stand before the mightiest king of all galaxies. He did not see them as people, he saw them as symbols, trophies of his dominance, and tools to flaunt before his rivals. The courtiers murmured their approval, eager to feed the king's vanity. Some even laughed at the sight of the trembling humans, as if their suffering were a play staged only for their amusement. The king raised a jeweled goblet filled with liquid light and took a long, slow drink, as though savoring the moment of his triumph. The family stood in silence, the father glaring defiantly though his body bore the weight of his chains, the mother clutching her daughter tightly, her eyes unwavering though they shimmered with hidden fear. To the king this display was nothing more than another performance of power, one of many he had enacted since his rise. He believed he had broken thousands before, and these humans would be no different. He thought them weak and fragile, a race of flesh and bone to easily shattered against the steel and fire of his armies. He dismissed the fire in their eyes as meaningless sparks that would die soon enough under his crushing rule. He leaned forward again, studying the child with mock curiosity. He asked her name in a tone that dripped with false kindness. When she hesitated, he laughed, a booming laugh that filled the chamber, and declared that it did not matter, for in his empire names were irrelevant, only obedience mattered. He told them they would serve as a reminder of his greatness, a tale he would spread across the stars, that even distant human colonies could not escape his reach. The guards tightened their hold, and the family was dragged to their knees, forced to bow before him. The king raised his arms in triumph, and the courtiers erupted in cheers. The sound echoed across the vaulted chamber, as if the walls themselves celebrated his arrogance. Yet beneath the surface of this display lay a fragile truth that none of them could see. The king believed he had gained pawns, but in truth he had placed himself directly in the path of a storm he could not control, a storm carried by the wrath of a woman who had carved her legend in battle, and who would soon bring her fury crashing upon his throne. What the king and his courtiers failed to grasp was the truth behind the family he had so casually claimed as trophies. They were not nameless wanderers, nor forgotten colonists. They were bound by blood to a woman whose very presence could silence a battlefield, a woman who was feared not only by her enemies, but by her own allies as well. This woman was a general forged in fire and tempered in endless war. She was known across galaxies as the storm that no wall could hold, the blade that no shield could stop, the mind that no rival could outmaneuver. The family he had chained and mocked were her heart, and though she never spoke of them in her campaigns, their existence was what anchored her humanity. Without them she was a relentless machine of war with no mercy and no pause, but with them she was a mother and a wife, and the balance between those two sides was delicate and dangerous. Few knew of this family, fewer still dared to speak of them, for the general protected their secret, fiercely guarding them from the eyes of her enemies. Yet now the Galactic King had done what no one else dared. He had reached into her hidden world and torn from it the only pieces she cherished. He believed this act would elevate him to greater heights that he could boast of capturing, not just faceless humans but blood tied to power. He thought himself clever, he thought himself invincible, but in truth he had stepped upon the edge of a blade so sharp it could split entire empires. The soldiers who dragged the family before him had not questioned the order, for obedience was their law yet. Whispers already began to stir among the ranks. Not all of them knew who the family belonged to, but some recognized subtle marks and symbols in their clothing, traces of heritage tied to the legendary general. Those whispers traveled quickly from lips to ears, carried like sparks across dry grass, and soon the embers of rumor threatened to ignite into wildfire beyond the throne room. Across the stars, in a sector controlled by human fleets, the first message of the abduction was carried on encrypted channels. It reached the ears of trusted officers who knew better than to delay, and within hours the truth was laid bare before the general herself. She stood silent when she heard it. Her soldiers watched closely, expecting rage or despair, but instead, she remained still, her face unreadable. She dismissed her officers and stood alone in the command chamber, staring into the endless void of space for long moments. She said nothing, then she closed her eyes and drew in a slow breath. When she opened them again, the silence was broken, not with tears, but with a voice cold and sharp. She spoke only once, declaring that the Galactic King had sealed his fate. Her officers returned at her command, and she gave no speech of comfort, no promises of mercy. She issued only orders, precise and absolute. She told them to ready the fleets, to sharpen their blades, to fuel their engines, and to prepare for a war unlike any they had waged before. And so while the king reveled in his arrogance, boasting of his new captives across the stars, the storm began to move. The universe itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the clash that would soon shake every world and every empire. For the king had not taken just a family, he had awakened the wrath of the most ruthless woman general. The general was a name spoken in fear and reverence across countless systems. She was not born into glory, but carved it, with her own hands, rising from the ashes of forgotten battles, to become the sharpest blade of the human fleets. Her strategies were studied by allies and dreaded by enemies. Every move she made was precise, every strike calculated to turn the tide of war. She had led armies against impossible odds, and walked away victorious each time, leaving wreckage in her wake and silence in the hearts of those who thought themselves untouchable. Her enemies had many names for her. Some called her the Iron Storm, others the Shadow Commander, but among humans she was simply known as the Ruthless General, for she showed no mercy to those who threatened her people, and she never accepted surrender without cost. Those who faced her either fell in battle or were crushed beneath her. relentless pursuit. Her presence on the battlefield was like the arrival of a new star burning through darkness, and no empire, no matter how vast, dared to underestimate her. Stories of her victories spread like wildfire through the galaxies. She had once defeated a fleet 3 times the size of her own, by luring them into the gravity well of a dying star and using the collapse to scatter their ships into chaos. She had crushed rebellions with swift precision, and dismantled pirate syndicates that had plagued the trade routes for centuries. When her flag appeared on the horizon of space, it was both a beacon of hope for her allies, and a sentence of doom for her enemies. But for all her reputation, she kept her personal life sealed away from prying eyes. Few knew she had a family, and those who did never dared to speak of them, for the general understood that love was both strength and vulnerability, and in her world weakness was a weapon others would use against her. She guarded them with secrecy, placing them far from the front lines, believing that distance would keep them safe. Yet fate and arrogance had pierced even her careful planning. Now, as the news of their capture burned in her ears, the legends of her ruthlessness took on a new shape. For never before had anyone threatened her heart so directly, never before had an enemy crossed that final line. The Galactic King had not simply taken prisoners, he had awakened a force that would not stop until his empire lay in ruins. She knew his kind, proud, arrogant, blind to the dangers of underestimating those he saw as lesser. She had defeated such men before, but never one who had dared to place her family in chains. Her officers watched as she paced the command chamber, her eyes cold as steel. Every word she spoke was measured, but each one carried the weight of doom. She reminded them of their oath, not only to the fleets, but to her cause. She told them that this was no ordinary mission, this was retribution and survival. Her voice never rose, yet it carried through the halls like a war drum, and every soldier felt the fire ignite in their chest. Across the fleet's engines roared to life, and weapons were loaded. Soldiers whispered prayers, some in fear, others in devotion, for they knew they would follow her into the mouth of death itself. The general had chosen her path, and it led directly to the throne of the Galactic King. His arrogance had written the first line of this war, and she would write the last with blood and fire. When the message reached the general of the abduction, she stood still as stone, and her soldiers did not dare to speak. Her eyes closed for a brief moment, and those who watched thought perhaps she would break, that she would weep or tremble. Yet, when her eyes opened again, there was no weakness in them, only fire and silence that spoke louder than any scream. She did not fall into despair. She did not beg the stars for mercy. She prepared for war. Her commanders gathered in the chamber, waiting for her command. Each one had fought by her side in countless battles, and each one knew the look in her eyes when vengeance had been set into motion. She said nothing at first, letting the weight of the moment stretch like a blade across the room. Finally she spoke her words, sharp and final. "The Galactic King has sealed his fate," she declared. The room fell into silence so deep it felt as though time itself had stopped. The general did not rage, she did not shout. Her fury was the kind that burned, cold and precise. She moved with purpose, her hands tracing maps of star systems, her mind calculating paths of assault and destruction. She knew the empire of the king was vast, but she also knew its cracks and weaknesses, for she had studied him from afar, waiting for the day his pride would make him stumble. Now that day had come. She summoned her fleets not with speeches of glory, but with orders of necessity. Every pilot, every soldier, every ship was placed into motion. Engines lit across the blackness of space, forming waves of fire that spread outward from her command. Like ripples of war, her armies did not hesitate, for they knew her reputation. They knew that when she commanded, victory was not simply hoped for, it was inevitable. General did not hide her intent. She broadcast her first strike openly to her officers, declaring that the king's border outposts would fall one by one. She would cut through his defenses like a storm through glass, and she would leave nothing standing. In her wake, her soldiers cheered, not from joy but from grim devotion, for they understood that she did not fight for conquest or wealth. She fought for blood and for family, and no force in the galaxy could match the wrath of a mother. As preparations surged, she stood at the heart of the command chamber, gazing into the vast horizon of stars. Her thoughts lingered on her family, their faces etched in her mind, their voices echoing in her heart. She saw the small hand of her daughter clutching tightly to her mother. She saw the defiant eyes of her husband, daring to resist, even in chains. Those visions hardened her resolve, until there was no room left for hesitation, only action. In that moment, the general transformed from commander to avenger. Her armies were not merely soldiers, they were the edge of her vengeance. Every ship, every weapon, every soldier was now part of a tide that would wash over the empire of the king and strip it bare. She would bring down his throne, his armies, his arrogance, until only ashes remained. The galaxy would tremble not because a war had begun but because a storm had awakened, and that storm carried the name of the most ruthless woman, General. The general moved with relentless focus. As her fleets prepared to strike, she issued commands with the calm certainty of a warrior who had lived her life in battle. Every order was carried out with precision as squadrons aligned and weapons systems lit across the dark expanse of space. The engines of her ships roared like thunder, and the stars themselves seemed to dim against the burning fire of her advancing armada. Her first target was the border outpost that guarded the entrance to the king's empire. It was a fortress of steel and stone orbiting a barren world, its walls bristling with cannons and patrol fleets. The commanders of the outpost believed themselves untouchable, for they served the Galactic King, and his rule was law. Yet when the general's fleets emerged from hyperspace, the defenders felt a chill, for they recognized the insignia etched on her flagship, and they knew their fate was already sealed. The battle began with silence broken only by the crackling hum of energy weapons as the general's ships unleashed a storm of fire. The outpost answered with volleys of missiles and beams of plasma, but the general had already anticipated their patterns. Her fleet moved like a living creature, flowing between attacks, striking with precision and vanishing before retaliation could land in minutes. The mighty fortress began to falter, its shields collapsing under the relentless assault. Soldiers who fought for the king tried to resist, but fear spread quickly through their ranks. They had heard the stories of the ruthless general, but stories were one thing, and reality another. The sight of her flagship cutting through their defenses like a blade through paper drained the fight from their hearts. Some surrendered, others fled, but none could stop the tide that bore down upon them. When the battle ended, the fortress lay in ruins, its flames lighting the barren world below like a second sun. The general did not celebrate. She did not pause. Her fleets regrouped and advanced to the next target. Her voice echoed through the comms, calm and steady, never wavering. She reminded her soldiers that this war was not for conquest but for vengeance. Every star they crossed, every enemy they struck, was one step closer to reclaiming her family. Her words ignited her soldiers with a fire that no fear could extinguish. World after world fell before her advance. Outposts crumbled, fleets shattered, strongholds collapsed. Entire sectors of the king's empire that had once stood proud now lay broken in the wake of her fury. The galaxy began to whisper her name once more, not as a commander of battles but as a storm that could not be contained. Those whispers reached even the throne of the king, though he dismissed them with arrogance, believing his core worlds were untouchable. But the general knew otherwise. She had studied his defenses for years. She knew where the cracks lay and how to widen them. With each victory her forces grew stronger, as defectors and rebels joined her cause, drawn by the promise of vengeance and the hope of freedom. Her war was no longer only her own, it was becoming a tide that pulled entire worlds into its current, and still, her focus remained sharp on the single truth that drove her every move. Her family waited in chains, and nothing in the galaxy, not armies, not empires, not kings, would stand between her and their freedom. The empire of the Galactic King had once been spoken of as eternal, its banners stretching across countless systems, its fleets blotting out the stars, and its laws written in fear upon every world. Yet under the relentless assault of the general, those banners began to burn one by one, and the once proud fleets scattered like ash in the wind. Entire systems that had bowed in silence to the king's rule now rose in rebellion, emboldened by the sight of his forces collapsing against the precision of her strikes. The general moved without hesitation. Her fleets struck swiftly, dismantling supply lines, toppling fortresses, and seizing communication hubs. She knew that to destroy the empire she needed not only to win battles, but to carve away its foundations piece by piece. She severed trade routes that fed the king's armies, she captured starports that connected his worlds, and she left entire garrisons stranded without aid or reinforcement. The empire that once seemed invincible was revealed to be fragile, built upon arrogance and fear rather than true strength. The king's commanders tried to rally their forces. They gathered fleets larger than the general's, hoping to crush her through sheer numbers, yet each time they clashed. She turned their strength into weakness. She lured them into ambushes where asteroids became her allies. She drew them into nebulae that blinded their sensors, and then struck with lethal precision. Her mind was a weapon sharper than any blade, and no tactic of theirs could match the depth of her foresight. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks of the king's soldiers. Some whispered that she was not human at all, but a spirit of vengeance risen from the void. Others said she was a weapon forged by the stars themselves, sent to punish arrogance and pride. Fear seeped into every corridor of the empire, and that fear grew faster than any order of loyalty, for soldiers fight best when they believe in their leader, and the king had given them only arrogance, while the general gave them the inevitability of doom. Entire planets surrendered without a fight, choosing to welcome her fleets rather than resist. The people saw her not only as a warrior but as a liberator, for wherever her forces passed, the chains of the king were broken. Her reputation as ruthless was true, for she showed no mercy to the soldiers of the king yet. She spared civilians, she protected the weak, and this earned her the loyalty of the masses with every victory. The foundation of the king's empire crumbled further in his palace. The Galactic King raged at the reports. His once endless armies dwindled, his once impenetrable fortresses burned. He called his advisors traitors, he accused his generals of cowardice, but deep within his heart a shadow grew. The arrogance that had once blinded him now trembled beneath the weight of fear. He began to realize, though he would never admit it aloud, that he had made a mistake unlike any before. The general pressed onward, never slowing, never faltering. Her eyes remained fixed on the heart of the empire, where her family was kept in chains. She would not rest until she had broken the throne itself. Her war was no longer simply a campaign of vengeance, it was a reckoning, and the universe itself seemed to wait for the final clash that would decide whether the empire of the king would endure or vanish into the silence of history. The Galactic King sat upon his throne that once shimmered with pride and power, yet now it felt heavy as chains upon his shoulders. The vast halls of his palace echoed, not with songs of victory but with whispers of defeat. His advisors brought him news each day, and each report struck like a dagger. Worlds had fallen, fleets had been shattered, generals had abandoned their posts or fled in fear. His empire that had once seemed eternal now crumbled before his very eyes, and for the first time in his reign he tasted the bitter truth of despair. He raged against his council, accusing them of weakness, calling them traitors. He shouted that his armies were still strong, that his throne was still unbroken, but deep within his heart he knew that lies could no longer shield him. The ruthless general moved closer with every passing hour, her fleets tearing through every defense. He thought unbreakable, every plan he devised was undone before it could even take form. As if she were inside his very mind, he began to see her not as a woman, not even as a soldier, but as an unstoppable storm born from the void, sent to erase him from the stars. The courtiers who once filled his palace with flattery now avoided his gaze. Their laughter was gone, replaced by the silence of fear. Even the soldiers who guarded his throne seemed uneasy, their eyes shifting toward the doors, as if expecting her shadow to appear at any moment. The walls that had always felt eternal now seemed fragile. The throne that had once felt eternal now seemed doomed. The king could no longer find comfort in the treasures around him, for they were nothing more than hollow reminders of an empire slipping away. In his darker moments he wondered if perhaps he should have ended the family quickly, spared himself this wrath. Yet arrogance still poisoned his thoughts, and he clung to the belief that he could still break her, that she was only one woman against the might of his empire. He ordered new fleets to be built. He demanded reinforcements from distant systems. He commanded his soldiers to stand firm, yet no matter how loudly he roared, no matter how many orders he gave, the tide of war continued to shift against him. Every hour brought him closer to the inevitable. She was not simply defeating him, she was dismantling everything he had built. She was turning the fear he once commanded into a weapon against him, and the galaxy itself seemed to turn its back upon his rule. He realized too late that he had underestimated not just a general but a mother and a wife whose love had been twisted into fury, stronger than any weapon he could command. The closer she came, the more his sleep was broken by visions. He dreamed of fire consuming his palace, of her eyes burning with cold vengeance, of her footsteps echoing in his halls. He awoke each time drenched in fear, his crown heavy in his trembling hands. He told himself he was still a king, yet the truth clawed at his soul. He was not a ruler, he was prey, and she was the hunter who would not stop until his throne was nothing but dust. The day of reckoning arrived. With the silence of a predator before the strike, the palace of the Galactic King stood tall upon a world of fire and steel, its towers reaching into the clouds, its walls gleaming with the wealth of countless conquered systems. Yet above that world, the sky darkened as the generals' fleets descended, their engines roaring like the fury of the stars themselves. Her armada surrounded the planet, cutting off every path of escape, and for the first time in its history, the heart of the king's empire trembled. The defenders fought with desperation, their ships forming lines around the world, their cannons spitting fire into the void. But the general had come, prepared. Her formations cut through them with merciless precision. Every trap the king had set was dismantled, every defense he had built was turned into rubble. Her soldiers pressed forward without hesitation, for they knew what this battle meant. They were not fighting for territory, they were fighting for the soul of their commander, and they would not fail her. Within the palace, the king listened to the thunder of explosions shaking the ground beneath his throne. His advisors begged him to flee, to retreat into the far reaches of space where he might rebuild, but he refused. He clung to his pride like a drowning man clings to broken wood. He roared that he was still the master of the stars, yet his voice quivered and his hands trembled. His eyes turned to the captives, the family he had chained. As trophies he thought to use them as his final shield, but even he began to sense that their presence had already sealed his doom. The gates of the palace shattered beneath the weight of the generals. Strike forces, her warriors, poured into the halls, cutting down resistance with relentless fury, their banners draped across the shattered walls, their footsteps echoing like drums of judgment. And at their head strode the general, her armor scarred from battle, her eyes burning with the cold fire of vengeance. She moved through the palace with purpose, each step carrying the weight of 1,000 victories and the promise of one final reckoning. At last she entered the throne chamber. The king rose to meet her, his crown crooked, his robe torn, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and fear. He shouted words of defiance, claiming that he still ruled, that she could never break him. But his voice cracked and his body betrayed him. Trembling, as she drew closer, she said nothing, for her silence was more terrifying than any threat. She looked past him, to her family, their eyes wide with hope and sorrow, and in that moment the war was already over. The final clash was brief, for the king no longer had the strength to resist. He fought with desperation, striking like a beast cornered, but the general moved with the precision of a storm. Her blade cut through his defenses, her fury broke his pride, and at last the Galactic King fell. His crown clattered to the ground, rolling across the floor until it came to rest at the feet of the woman who had destroyed his empire. The general rushed to her family, breaking their chains and gathering them into her arms. The halls that once rang with arrogance now echoed with the sound of reunion. The soldiers of the king lowered their weapons, surrendering not out of loyalty, but out of fear and respect for the woman who had shattered their ruler. The universe itself seemed to exhale as the storm subsided, leaving only silence and the weight of what had been lost. From that day forward, the story of the Galactic King and his fatal mistake spread across the stars. His name became a warning, and hers became a legend. She was remembered not only as the most ruthless general, but as the avenger who destroyed an empire for love of her family, and the galaxy whispered that no throne, no crown, no power could ever stand against the wrath of a mother.